Emma Harper had always felt out of place in her small Appalachian. At 19, most of her peers were focused on college parties, weekend trips, and figuring out their social lives, but Emma's head was elsewhere. She was drawn to the military, to the machines that could soar above the world, and to the idea of being part of something bigger than herself. Growing up, she had watched documentaries about helicopter pilots, read biographies of decorated aviators, and spent hours at the local airfield, studying the mechanics of rotor blades and cockpit instruments. It wasn't a hobby, it was a calling. When Emma enlisted in the Army National Guard, people had laughed at her. "You're just a kid," they said. "Let the men handle the Black Hawks." But Emma thrived on proving people wrong. She spent hours in simulators, memorizing every emergency procedure, learning the feel of the controls until her hands moved almost instinctively. She wasn't the strongest physically, but her mind worked with a precision that few veterans could match. Her instructors began noticing the way she anticipated turbulence before it hit, how she corrected mistakes instinctively, how she remained calm under pressure. "Harper has something," one officer finally admitted after a routine flight test. "Something rare." The winter morning began like any other, with Emma in the base hangar, checking instruments and reviewing flight plans. The sky above was gray, clouds hanging low, and the wind whispered through the tarmac. She was focused on calibrating a Black Hawk's navigation system when the call came over the radio, urgent, terse, and hikers were trapped in a remote section of the Appalachian Mountains, with a sudden snowstorm rolling in faster than anyone had anticipated. "Black Hawks, scramble immediately. Conditions are deteriorating. Lives are at risk." The words sent a shiver down her spine. It was one thing to train in simulated blizzards. It was another to face the real thing, where failure could mean death. Her heart raced as the hangar doors creaked open and the massive rotor blades began to spin. Emma climbed into the cockpit, her fingers tightening around the controls. The seasoned pilots around her shot glances in her direction. "You sure you're ready, kid?" asked one, his voice carrying a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Emma met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm ready," she said simply. In that moment, she felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. Fear because this was real, exhilaration because this was exactly where she had always wanted to be. The Black Hawk lifted off the tarmac with a roar, shaking slightly in the icy wind. As they gained altitude, the mountains came into view, their jagged peaks veiled by thick, swirling snow. Emma scanned the horizon, plotting the safest path through the treacherous terrain. Her co-pilot monitored the instruments, exchanging brief, tense glances with her as the storm grew fiercer. The radio crackled intermittently, carrying fragmented updates about the hiker's location. Every second mattered. Emma's pulse quickened, but her hands were steady, moving with the rhythm of countless practice flights. She could feel the weight of responsibility settling over her shoulders, heavier than any pack she had ever carried. This wasn't just a mission. It was a test of whether a kid from a quiet town could rise to meet the impossible. And then it happened. Over the roar of the engines, a voice cut through the radio, sharp and commanding. "Harper, we need you." It wasn't just a request, it was recognition. The Black Hawks were saying her name out loud, and in that moment, Emma understood that she had crossed a line. She wasn't a kid anymore. She was a pilot, entrusted with lives hanging in the balance, and the world, or at least the mountains, was about to find out what she could do. The Black Hawk sliced through the gray sky, its rotors whipping snow into a blur around the cockpit. Emma Harper's eyes were glued to the instruments, scanning altimeter readings and wind speeds while simultaneously keeping an unblinking watch on the swirling mountains below. The storm had intensified, gusts lashing against the helicopter like invisible fists, and the visibility dropped with each passing second. Her co-pilot, a veteran named Sergeant Daniels, tightened his harness and muttered under his breath. "These winds, they'll throw anyone off in a heartbeat." Emma simply nodded, her jaw set, refusing to let doubt creep in. Every second counted. Every misstep could mean death for the hikers and failure for her first real mission. They followed the coordinates relayed from the emergency beacon, winding through the peaks like hunters tracking prey. Emma's hands moved instinctively, tilting and adjusting the controls with a grace that belied her years. She had trained for this, but simulation could never mimic the cold, the unpredictable gusts, or the roaring void beneath. The cabin shook as a sudden downdraft struck, sending the Black Hawk tilting dangerously. Daniels muttered a curse, but Emma's voice cut through, calm and commanding. "Steady. Hold your position. Watch the slope below. We'll get them." The team exchanged glances, a mixture of tension and awe washing over them. The kid was doing what seasoned pilots sometimes hesitated to attempt. Below them, the mountains were a frozen labyrinth. Snow had buried rocks and hidden crevices, transforming familiar terrain into an unforgiving trap. The hikers, 2 college students on a winter excursion, clung desperately to a jagged ledge, faces pale and lips tinged blue. Visibility was near zero from their perspective. One wrong step could have been fatal. The emergency beacon's light flickered weakly in the storm, guiding Emma like a lighthouse in a black sea of snow. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "I see them," she said. "Prepare the hoist. Daniels, I need a stable hover. Watch my signals." Every second in that frozen vortex was a gamble. The rotors roared and the wind tore at the fuselage, threatening to throw the helicopter off balance. Emma's fingers danced over the controls, micro-adjusting for turbulence that felt almost alive. Below, a snow-laden boulder shifted, a reminder that nature had no mercy. Emma's heart pounded, yet her mind was icy with focus. "This is it," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. The team followed her commands with a precision that matched her own. One of the hikers shouted, their voice barely audible through the storm. Emma's gaze locked onto them, and she felt an unexpected surge of calm. Hovering was the hardest part. One miscalculation and the hoist cable could swing, endangering everyone. The wind buffeted the helicopter, forcing Emma to tilt the nose and counterbalance with micro-adjustments that required every ounce of concentration. "Almost there," she called, signaling to Daniels and the crew. The hoist descended, a lifeline into the abyss below. Emma's eyes flicked between instruments and the rocky ledge, every movement choreographed like a dangerous ballet. The hikers looked up in disbelief at the young pilot keeping them alive, their frozen faces registering both fear and awe. And then it happened. A gust ripped through the ravine, twisting the Black Hawk slightly, and Emma's hands responded instinctively, correcting the tilt, guiding the cable with flawless timing. The first hiker was secured, lifted slowly toward the helicopter, and Emma felt the subtle shift in weight. Her heart raced, but her voice remained steady. "Second one now, steady, steady." The second hiker grabbed the harness, eyes wide, and Emma guided them up, every second stretching into eternity. When both were finally inside, she exhaled, a long, shuddering release of tension. As the Black Hawk banked away from the ravine, the storm still raging around them, Daniels let out a low whistle. "Kid, I don't know how you did that," he muttered. Emma simply shook her head, exhaustion already nibbling at the edges of her focus. "We did it," she said, glancing at the rescued hikers, shivering but alive. For the first time in her young career, Emma Harper felt the weight of responsibility, and the quiet, undeniable thrill of knowing she had just saved lives that depended entirely on her skill, nerve, and courage. The roar of the Black Hawk's rotors was deafening, but Emma Harper barely registered it. Her focus was absolute, locked onto the swirling white landscape below and the delicate balance of the helicopter above. The hikers, wrapped in emergency blankets, shivered violently in the cabin, their eyes wide as they tried to comprehend what had just happened. Emma stole a glance at them, 2 teenagers, pale and frostbitten, who owed their lives to her steady hands and quick thinking. Relief flickered across her face, mingled with the adrenaline that still coursed through her veins. But there was no time to relax. The storm outside was relentless, and the journey back to base would be just as dangerous. Visibility had dropped further. Snow whipped across the cockpit windshield in violent sheets, distorting every landmark into a gray blur. Emma's hands moved with the precision of a surgeon, adjusting altitude, managing the pitch, and compensating for sudden gusts that tried to wrest control from her. Her co-pilot, Sergeant Daniels, barked over the radio, "Harper, we're hitting turbulence ahead." She responded with calm authority, issuing concise instructions to the crew. The Black Hawk shuddered and leaned against the wind, but under Emma's guidance it didn't falter. Each second was a test of nerves, each movement a potential difference between life and death. The hikers whispered among themselves, uncertain whether to speak or remain frozen in awe. Emma couldn't blame them. Most people had never seen a helicopter dance through a storm like this, let alone one piloted by someone barely out of adolescence. Yet for Emma, the chaos was strangely familiar. Every hour spent in simulators, every late-night study session poring over rotor mechanics and emergency protocols had led to this moment. Her instincts had sharpened beyond the classroom. They were alive, reacting faster than thought. She adjusted the collective gently, tilted the cyclic, and felt the Black Hawk respond like an extension of her own body. A sudden blast of wind from the north jarred the helicopter violently, throwing the cabin into a brief but terrifying moment of instability. The hikers screamed, clutching each other and the straps inside, but Emma's voice cut through, calm and unwavering. "Steady, hold your position." The crew followed her lead instinctively, trusting the kid who had somehow become their anchor in the chaos. She corrected the tilt, countered the drift, and felt a surge of pride mingled with the adrenaline. This was no longer practice. This was life, raw and unforgiving, and she was keeping it together. As they navigated the treacherous mountain pass, Emma noticed one of the hikers staring at her with awestruck eyes. I can't believe you're just a kid," he muttered. Emma allowed herself a brief, wry smile but didn't respond. Words weren't necessary. Every maneuver, every instinctive adjustment was her statement. The storm raged on, but the Black Hawk responded to her like a living thing, a machine tempered by experience and courage. She thought of the lives depending on her skills, and her determination hardened. She wouldn't fail them. Suddenly, a jagged ridge appeared out of the white, closer than expected. Emma's pulse quickened. One wrong miscalculation and the helicopter could scrape the rock face. She adjusted immediately, her eyes scanning the instruments, the terrain, and the faint traces of a path through the storm. "Brace yourselves," she called. The Black Hawk tilted and climbed sharply, narrowly avoiding disaster. The hikers' gasps were almost drowned out by the rotor blades, but Emma felt a quiet surge of triumph. Each challenge reinforced her resolve. By the time they cleared the ridge, the storm's fury hadn't lessened, but Emma's confidence had. She had led her crew through danger, rescued 2 strangers, and emerged intact. The adrenaline buzzed in her veins, mingling with a quiet, profound satisfaction. Today, she wasn't just a small-town girl. She was a pilot who had earned the trust and respect of every veteran in that helicopter. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. Emma Harper's Black Hawk hovered over the jagged slope, rotors slicing the icy air as snow whipped against the windshield in chaotic torrents. Below, the hikers clung desperately to a ledge barely wide enough for their feet. The wind tore at the trees and rocks around them, creating a symphony of danger that threatened to swallow the crew and the victims alike. Inside the cabin, Emma's co-pilot, Sergeant Daniels, and the crew braced themselves, eyes wide with tension. They had flown through storms before, but nothing compared to this moment. A real rescue, on the edge of life and death, orchestrated by a 19-year-old pilot. Emma's hands moved like a conductor guiding a complex orchestra. Every micro-adjustment mattered. Tilt the nose slightly, increase the collective, counter the gusts. Her instincts, honed through countless hours in simulators, guided her, yet the reality of the storm made every decision critical. She had studied this scenario in theory, but the cold, blinding snow and jagged cliffs were more merciless than anything on a screen. One wrong move and the hoist cable could swing disastrously, endangering everyone. Yet Emma remained calm, her voice steady, issuing instructions with confidence. "Hoist ready. Daniels, give me a stable hover," she said, glancing briefly at the gauges. The cable descended slowly, swaying slightly in the turbulent wind. The first hiker, a young woman with frostbitten fingers, reached up, gripping the harness with a trembling hand. Emma watched the delicate balance, adjusting the helicopter's position minutely to compensate for every gust. "You've got this," she called down, her voice firm yet reassuring. The crew held their breath. Outside, snow gusted violently, threatening to topple the operation, but inside the cockpit, Emma was a calm center, focused on precision and timing. Slowly, inch by inch, the hiker lifted from the ledge, her wide eyes reflecting terror and awe in equal measure. As the first hiker cleared the ledge, Emma felt the shift in weight and immediately corrected for it. The Black Hawk tilted, then stabilized, guided by her precise instincts. Daniels whispered a low, awed comment. "Kid, you're unreal." Emma allowed herself a brief flicker of pride, but there was no time to dwell. The second hiker was clinging to a rock barely visible through the swirling snow. "Second one now," she instructed. The cable descended again, swaying dangerously. The young man reached for it, frostbitten fingers shaking uncontrollably. Emma guided him with gentle but firm commands, tilting the helicopter just enough to allow a smooth ascent. Time seemed to stretch as the hoist lifted the second hiker toward the cabin. Every second was amplified by the storm, by the weight of responsibility pressing on Emma's shoulders. The Black Hawk leaned precariously, yet she kept it stable, her hands moving with absolute confidence. The storm's roar was deafening, but her focus was singular. Bring them up safely. Inch by inch, the hiker was lifted, and when both victims were finally secured in the cabin, a collective exhale of relief rippled through the crew. Emma pulled the helicopter back from the ledge, circling above the tree line. The wind still screamed, snow obscuring vision, but she maintained composure. The crew looked at her with a mixture of astonishment and respect. Daniels shook his head, muttering, "Most vets wouldn't have done it that cleanly." Emma allowed herself a small smile, but her mind was already scanning the mountains below. The mission wasn't over yet. They were still in the storm, and she knew every second of the journey back would demand the same precision, courage, and calm that had saved the hikers' lives. For the first time, Emma Harper truly felt the weight of being a pilot. Not just a student, not just a kid from a small town, but someone whose decisions directly affected lives. And in that storm, with snow swirling like shards of glass, she understood something fundamental. Courage wasn't about fearlessness. It was about steadiness when fear was unavoidable, clarity when chaos reigned, and action when hesitation could mean death. She had found it within herself, and the Black Hawk responded as if aware that she was no longer just learning. She was in command. The Black Hawk sliced through the storm-laden sky, carrying the two rescued hikers toward safety. Inside the cabin, the warmth from emergency blankets and the hum of the helicopter contrasted sharply with the bitter, unforgiving cold outside. The hikers were pale and trembling, faces still etched with shock, but alive. Emma Harper kept her focus razor-sharp, her hands steady on the controls, yet she allowed herself a fleeting glance at the two young faces. Relief flickered in their eyes as they realized they had been lifted from the edge of death. For Emma, that moment of human connection, the silent acknowledgement of trust, was as powerful as the roar of the rotor blades. Sergeant Daniels sat beside her, exhaustion beginning to show in the lines of his face. "You did good, kid," he murmured, a quiet awe in his tone. Emma offered a small nod, a wry smile crossing her features. She wasn't looking for praise, but the recognition from veterans who had flown longer and risked more than she ever had was quietly validating. Every decision she made, every micro-adjustment in the storm, had been about keeping them alive, not glory. Yet it was undeniable that, in those few hours, she had crossed a line from trainee to trusted pilot. As the Black Hawk descended toward the base, the storm began to relent, clouds breaking just enough to reveal glimpses of the ground below. Emma's focus shifted to navigation and landing, ensuring that the helicopter touched down smoothly. Each second remained critical. The Black Hawk's rotors still had to contend with residual winds and snow gusts that could jolt the aircraft dangerously. Her hands moved with methodical precision, adjusting the collective and cyclic in tandem, feeling the machine respond as if it were an extension of her body. Every muscle was taut with concentration, yet beneath the tension was a quiet pride. Upon touchdown, the cabin erupted in relief. The hikers stumbled from the helicopter, guided by crew members, their expressions a mixture of amazement and gratitude. Parents and rescue officials, who had been monitoring the storm from a safe distance, approached quickly, praising the skill and bravery of the team. But their eyes kept returning to Emma, the young pilot who had led the rescue with calm authority and precision. For the first time, she saw the reflection of what she had accomplished, the recognition that saving lives wasn't about age or experience. It was about focus, courage, and unwavering resolve. The debriefing that followed was surreal. Reports had already begun trickling in, painting Emma as the teenage pilot who the mountains, yet she felt only the lingering adrenaline and the weight of responsibility. Her colleagues patted her on the back, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others offering quiet words of respect. Emma listened, aware that accolades were secondary. What mattered was that 2 lives had been saved because of her skill and presence of mind. That night, as she cleaned and inspected the helicopter, she reflected on the mission, the storm, the fear, and the triumph. Even as fatigue began to seep into her bones, Emma felt a transformation within herself. The kid who had arrived at the base months earlier, unsure of her place, had now stepped into a role defined by capability and calm under pressure. The Black Hawks had announced her presence with a simple call over the radio, but the true validation came from knowing she could handle responsibility, danger, and fear simultaneously. She realized that respect wasn't given, it was earned in moments like these. Later, alone in the hangar, Emma allowed herself a quiet smile. The mountains outside were now calm, blanketed in fresh snow, but the memory of the storm lingered. She knew more challenges would come, more missions would test her limits. Yet in that storm, hovering over a jagged ridge with lives in her hands, she had discovered something essential about herself. She wasn't just a kid. She was a pilot, a rescuer, a leader in the making. And the Black Hawks and the people who needed them would never forget her name. In the weeks following the rescue, Emma Harper returned to base, but things felt different. The familiar hangar no longer seemed ordinary. Every rotor blade, every instrument panel, every hum of machinery now carried weight. Her colleagues looked at her differently, with quiet acknowledgement, sometimes with admiration, occasionally with disbelief. The mission had changed something fundamental. She was no longer just the kid. She was a pilot who had proven herself in the storm, who had taken lives literally into her hands and returned them safely. Emma felt a strange mixture of pride and unease. Pride because she had accomplished something extraordinary. Unease because she had glimpsed the responsibility that came with her role, and it was vast. Training resumed, but nothing was quite the same. Exercises that once seemed monotonous now felt like preparation for real-life stakes. Emma threw herself into drills with renewed intensity, determined not to rest on the reputation she had earned. Each flight was an opportunity to sharpen her instincts, to anticipate emergencies before they arose, to prove, if only to herself, that the Black Hawk had been right to trust her. Her co-pilot Daniels became a quiet mentor, offering subtle guidance and sharing stories of past missions. "You've got the instincts," he said one day as they flew through a routine exercise. "Now it's about sharpening them. You're already on their radar, kid. Don't waste it." Word of the mission spread beyond the base. Local newspapers highlighted the story. The teenage pilot who had braved a winter storm to save hikers. Online forums buzzed with admiration. Some questioned whether it was safe to allow someone so young to pilot a Black Hawk in a storm, while others marveled at her skill. Emma read the coverage with detached interest, but she didn't let it swell her ego. She knew the headlines only told part of the story. The adrenaline, the fear, the split-second decisions were invisible to the public eye. Only she, Daniels, and her crew knew the depth of what they had endured. Even routine flights carried a new sense of urgency. Each rotation, each hover, each maneuver through wind gusts and mountainous terrain reminded Emma of what she had faced. She analyzed every flight afterward, noting areas for improvement, calculating what she could do better next time. Her instructors began giving her more responsibility, assigning her to lead smaller missions and mentoring newer recruits. Where once she had been tentative, now she was confident, not cocky, but steady, measured, and decisive. Her colleagues began to look to her for guidance, a reversal that only underscored how far she had come in such a short time. One afternoon, during a routine inspection of the Black Hawk's instruments, Emma allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She thought of the hikers, of their pale faces and wide eyes, of the moment she had steadied the helicopter against the storm's fury. She remembered the sense of weight, of life itself pressing down on her shoulders, and how she had met it without faltering. That moment had changed her, not into someone fearless, but into someone who understood that courage was measured in action, not absence of fear. Her growth did not go unnoticed. Senior officers began addressing her by name during briefings, citing her in discussions of training protocols and emergency procedures. Younger recruits sought her out for advice, curious about the composure she had displayed in her first real mission. Emma Harper had become more than a pilot. She had become a standard, an example, a quiet beacon of capability in a high-stakes world. She had stepped from the shadows of her youth into a space reserved for those who could rise under pressure. As the sun dipped behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the base, Emma climbed into the Black Hawk for another routine flight. The wind was calm tonight, the skis clear, but she felt the familiar thrill of responsibility coursing through her veins. She was ready for any mission, any storm, any challenge. The kid who had once been underestimated had become someone the Black Hawks could rely on. And deep down, Emma Harper knew this was only the beginning of a journey that would demand everything she had and more. Months passed, and Emma Harper's reputation as a capable, steady pilot had grown quietly but unmistakably within the National Guard. She had flown countless missions since that first winter rescue, some routine, some training exercises, but nothing tested her like the call that came one stormy evening in early March. The base buzzed with urgent chatter over the radio. A small private plane had gone down in a remote stretch of the Appalachian backcountry. Reports were sketchy, and visibility was near zero. Veteran pilots hesitated, weighing the risk, but Emma's instincts sharpened instantly. She knew she couldn't ignore it. The Black Hawk roared to life beneath her hands, the familiar vibrations thrumming through the cockpit. Sergeant Daniels glanced at her, a mix of respect and quiet concern etched across his face. "You sure you want this one?" he asked. Emma didn't answer immediately. She studied the radar, calculated the wind patterns, and felt that same surge of clarity she had discovered months ago. "I'm ready," she said, her voice calm and resolute. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to acknowledge her determination, as if it were testing her again before allowing her passage. The flight was treacherous. Snow swirled in thick curtains, reducing visibility to near blindness, while gusts threatened to throw the Black Hawk off course. Every maneuver demanded her full attention. Slight shifts of the cyclic, subtle adjustments of the collective, tilting and banking against winds that could have easily grounded any other pilot. The crew trusted her implicitly now, moving in sync with her commands as though she were an extension of the aircraft itself. Emma felt the weight of responsibility, but it was no longer a burden. It was a challenge she welcomed. Hours seemed to stretch into an eternity as they approached the reported crash site. The mountain ridges loomed ominously through the snow, jagged and unyielding. Then, almost imperceptibly, a faint glow caught her eye, the remnants of the plane's emergency beacon. She adjusted the helicopter's position, hovering with surgical precision despite the violent gusts. "I see it," she whispered, signaling to Daniels and the crew. Below, the wreckage was half buried in snow, and the lone survivor struggled to remain conscious. Emma's hands moved instinctively, guiding the hoist with flawless timing. The operation was a ballet of tension and precision. The survivor, pale and shivering, grasped the harness as Emma stabilized the helicopter. The wind tore at the aircraft, tilting it dangerously, but she countered each gust with a micro-adjustment, balancing the Black Hawk as though it were an extension of her own body. Daniels muttered under his breath, "Kid, you're unreal." But Emma only nodded, her attention fixed entirely on the task. Inch by inch, the survivor rose toward the cabin, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief. Once safely aboard, Emma banked the helicopter away from the crash site, circling above the mountains to assess the safest route back to base. The storm continued to howl, but she navigated with calm precision, avoiding hidden ridges and ice-slicked cliffs. Her crew began to relax slightly, trusting her instincts as they had countless times before. Emma realized that what had once been doubt from herself and others had been replaced with confidence. She wasn't just flying the Black Hawk, she was commanding it. By the time they landed, the survivor was stable, and the crew erupted in quiet applause, faces flushed with relief. This mission, like the first, had tested her limits, but it had also cemented her place as a trusted pilot. She stepped from the cockpit, her coat dusted with snow, and for the first time in months, allowed herself to truly feel the significance of what she had done. Emma Harper was no longer just a kid. She was a pilot, a rescuer, and a leader in the making. The base was quiet as Emma Harper climbed from the Black Hawk, her boots crunching in the thin layer of snow that had settled on the tarmac. The adrenaline from the mission still thrummed through her veins, a familiar companion now rather than a stranger. Around her, crew members moved to secure the helicopter, checking instruments and rotor blades, but Emma's eyes were distant, reflecting on the storm, the crash, and the survivor they had saved. Every detail of the mission replayed vividly. The gusts that threatened to throw the Black Hawk off course, the careful coordination of the hoist, the weight of life itself resting in her hands. Sergeant Daniels approached, a rare smile crossing his face. "You did it again, Harper," he said quietly. "And this time, you did it without a single hesitation." Emma nodded, her expression calm but her mind still racing. Months had passed since her first mission, yet each challenge had forced her to grow in ways she hadn't imagined. She had been a kid, underestimated and dismissed, and now she was a pilot whose skill, precision, and courage were recognized by the most seasoned veterans. The Black Hawks, once symbols of daunting power, had become instruments in her hands, extensions of her determination and instincts. The survivor, wrapped in blankets and assisted by medical personnel, looked at Emma with a mixture of awe and gratitude. I can't believe you saved me," he stammered, his voice shaky. Emma simply smiled, shaking her head. "I didn't do it alone. You hung on, that's what matters," she said softly. The words were modest, but they carried weight. For Emma, this was never about recognition. It was about the people whose lives depended on her composure, skill, and courage. Yet quietly, she realized that recognition would always follow those who answered the call when others hesitated. As the night fell and lights flickered across the base, Emma wandered toward the hangar. She paused to watch the Black Hawks, their rotors now still, silhouettes against the starry sky. She had flown countless missions since her first rescue, each one shaping her into someone more confident, more capable, more aware of the stakes she faced. Each storm had tested her, but each time she emerged stronger, more precise, more trusted. Where once she had been a small-town girl with a dream, she was now a pilot whose name inspired respect across the unit. Later, in the quiet of the briefing room, senior officers formally acknowledged her contributions. Commendations were discussed, briefings mentioned her by name, and newer recruits looked to her as an example. Emma absorbed it silently. It wasn't the medals or the praise that mattered, though she allowed herself a small, quiet pride. It was knowing that she had transformed fear into action, hesitation into decisiveness, and uncertainty into lives saved. That journey had begun months earlier with a simple yet urgent call, and it had taken her from being a kid to someone who carried immense responsibility with grace. Standing alone outside the base later, Emma gazed at the mountains. The same peaks that had once seemed menacing and impenetrable now felt like markers of her growth. She remembered the snow-laden ledges, the gusting winds, the moments of doubt, and the exhilaration of mastery. Courage, she realized, was not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. Strength was not measured by age, but by willingness to rise when others could not. And leadership, she understood, was earned quietly through deeds, consistency, and unwavering composure under pressure. Emma Harper, once just a kid from a small Appalachian town, had become a pilot whose name resonated through the Black Hawks whenever danger arose. She had answered every call with determination, skill, and calm precision. The mountains, storms, and lives she had saved were now etched into her identity. And as she looked at the horizon, snow glistening under the moonlight, she knew with certainty that the call of duty would always find her, and when it did, she would answer. No longer just a kid. Not just a pilot, a rescuer, a force that would be remembered.